The rain began before dawn, not with any sudden drama, but as a slow settling in of the weather, a steady whisper against the glass that you could hear even before you opened your eyes. In the great house, the long curtains barely stirred as the damp crept in around the window frames, the cool air lying along the corridors like an extra blanket. Down below, in the washhouse that sat a little apart from the main house across a cobbled yard, the sound arrived first as a soft drumming on the slate roof, then as a trickle into the water butt, then as the gurgle of the drainpipe emptying itself onto the stones. The laundress, whose name was Mrs. Resounds, Harlow, though nobody called her anything but Harlow in the way of old servants, had felt the change in the air even as she slept in her small room above the dairy, and had woken knowing that this would be a washday of weather, the sort that wrapped the whole estate in a grey shroud and made the indoors feel like a small island of firelight. You might have seen her crossing the yard just after first light, her figure wrapped in a thick wool shawl the colour of damp bark, carrying a large wicker basket of soiled sheets balanced against her hip. The basket had been collected the evening before from the linen press at the end of the upstairs passage, brought down the back stairs while the family were at dinner, and stored overnight under a clean cloth in the scullery. Now Harlow made her way over the uneven cobbles, the rain beading on her shawl and on the handles of the basket, her boots finding the familiar route around the puddles that always formed near the pump. The rain was not cold enough to be unpleasant, just a steady coolness that freshened the skin and made the air smell of wet stone and wet earth and the faint sweetness of the climbing roses that clung to the washhouse wall, their petals dark with water. A robin watched from the woodshed door, fluffing its feathers, and a wisp of smoke from the kitchen chimney drifted sideways in the damp air, and everything was quiet except the rain. The washhouse door stood ajar, the wood swollen with the moisture so that Harlow had to push it with her shoulder, and as it opened the smell of the room came out to meet her. Cold stone, old wood ash, the metallic tang of the copper boiler, and beneath that the ghost of 1,000 washdays, lye and tallow soap, and boiling cotton. She set the basket down on the long wooden sorting table that ran beneath the window, a table whose surface was pale with years of scrubbing, worn into a gentle hollow in the center where sheets had been rubbed and folded over decades. The rain fell against the window, a high-leaded window of small panes, and the light that came through was the soft grey light of a sun that would not appear today, a light that made everything inside look muted and gentle, like a drawing in chalk. Harlow hung her shawl on a peg by the door and tied a white apron over her work dress, the strings smoothing around her waist with a gesture that was entirely automatic. The fire was not yet lit. The copper was cold and the room held a deep stillness that felt like waiting. On the table the sheets lay in a tumble of white cotton and linen, each piece still holding the shape of the sleepers who had lain beneath them, each one marked with the faint creases of a night's rest. She began to sort through them, one by one, lifting each sheet and shaking it out with a soft snap that released a puff of scent, lavender from the press, the clean dry scent of the linen itself, and a trace of wood smoke from the upstairs fireplaces that had warmed the bedrooms. The rain drummed on the roof and ran in rivulets down the window, distorting the view of the yard into something watery and impressionistic, a blur of green and grey and brown. The sheets told her stories, as they always did. Here was the fine percale from the master's bed, its hems embroidered with a simple monogram, the cloth still smooth except where the sleeper's shoulder had pressed. Here was the coarser linen from the nursery, with a small stain of milk near one corner that would require a little extra rubbing. Here was a pillowcase missing a button, the thread still dangling where it had pulled loose. Harlow tucked it to one side, making a mental note to sew it back on before the next pressing. She worked through the whole basket in this way, her fingers travelling over the fabric with the patience of someone who has done this same task for more than 40 years, since she was a girl in the scullery herself. The inspection was slow, methodical, each sheet turned over and held up to the light to check for small tears or warm spots that might give way in the boil, and all the while the rain maintained its steady, quiet rhythm, a sound that filled the silence without breaking it. The washhouse itself deserved a long look, for it was a room that had been built for this one purpose, and had seen little change since the house was first raised in the time of the old king. The walls were of stone, plastered and whitewashed long ago, now mellowed to a creamy tone that took the light softly. The ceiling was high, crossed by a single massive oak beam from which hung a collection of dried herbs, rosemary, lavender, wormwood tied in bundles with string, their fragrance seeping gradually into the air as the moisture of the day softened them. The floor was of flagstones, each one a different shape and shade of grey, worn into slight hollows, where countless feet had passed between the door and the copper and the trough. In the centre of the far wall stood the great fireplace, its hearth raised a step from the floor, the brickwork stained black with soot from hundreds of fires. Inside the fireplace sat the copper boiler itself, a huge vessel of riveted copper and iron, its surface a mottled pattern of dark brown and verdigris, its wide mouth open to the ceiling, its belly able to hold enough water to wash a whole week's linen in one long boil. A chain hung from a bracket above it, used for nothing in particular, and beside it a wooden paddle stood propped against the brick, its handle smooth as silk. Harlow crossed to the fire and laid her hand on the rim of the copper, feeling the cold metal under her palm. There was a little ash still in the grate from the last fire, a fine grey powder that shifted when she blew on it gently, and the fire irons stood in their stand, a poker and a pair of tongs and a small shovel. The woodpile was stacked against the left-hand wall, a neat arrangement of split logs and kindling, and a willow basket full of wood shavings that the garden boy had brought up from the carpentry shed. Next to it, a coal scuttle in black iron, its lid lying crooked. Everything was in its place, ready for the day's work, and Harlow allowed herself a moment of stillness, listening to the rain on the roof, watching the grey light slide across the copper's rim, feeling the cool air on her cheeks. Returning to the table, she finished sorting the last of the pillowcases, the monograms counted, and the tiers noted, and then she brought out a small sewing box from a cupboard near the water pump. The box was made of walnut, its lid inlaid with a simple star, and inside it held wooden spools of white thread, needles of different sizes, a little silver thimble, and a scrap of beeswax. She threaded a needle with the ease of lifelong practice, holding it up to the light that fell through the rain-streaked window, and began to mend the torn button on the pillowcase. Her stitches were small and neat, each one pulling the fabric together with a soft whisper of thread against cotton, the needle dipping and rising in a rhythm that matched the rain. While she sewed, she listened to the sounds of the house waking up, a door closing somewhere far away, the clatter of a coal bucket in the kitchen passage, a rooster crowing from the stable yard, the low murmur of voices as the housemaids began their morning rounds. All these noises came to her muffled by the rain and the thick walls, as if they were happening in another world, and the washhouse remained its own quiet bubble, smelling of stone and old lavender and the cold copper waiting for the fire. The mending took a little time, but not so long, and when it was done, Harlow snipped the thread with a small pair of scissors and laid the pillowcase with the others. She folded the sheets roughly, just enough to keep them from trailing on the floor, and stacked them beside the copper so that they would be ready when the water boiled. The room was starting to feel less cold now, not because the air had warmed, but because her body had been moving, and the wool of her dress and apron held the heat of her, and she paused to roll up her sleeves to the elbow, the skin of her forearms pale and strong. The rain had not stopped, not once, and it showed no sign of easing. If anything, it was falling more heavily now, a steady downpour that beat against the glass with a soft roar and filled the overflow of the water butt to a constant trickle. The sound was so continuous that it quickly became a sort of silence of its own, a backdrop against which every small action, the snip of scissors, the shuffle of linen, the breath she drew, stood out in quiet clarity. Before lighting the fire, Harlow stepped to the pump in the corner, a tall iron pump painted green many years ago, the paint now flaking in scalloped shapes. She primed it with a little water kept in a dipper, working the handle up and down until the water gushed out in a clear, cold stream that splashed into the bucket she held beneath the spout. The water came from the estate's own spring, filtered through the chalk hills and emerging from the ground with a mineral bite, cold enough to make her teeth ache just to think of it. She filled one bucket and then another, setting them on the stone floor near the copper, the water shivering with the vibration of her steps. Later she would heat some of this water for the rinsing, but for now it simply waited, its surface calm and reflecting the pale rectangle of the window. With everything prepared, Harlow stood before the cold copper once more and looked at the neatly stacked wood and the waiting kindling, and she felt the weight of the day ahead settle around her like a familiar garment. There was no need to hurry. The rain would continue and the sheets would not spoil and the fire would burn for as long as she needed it to. The house above her went about its morning, oblivious of the small dramas unfolding in the washhouse, and Harlow allowed herself one more pause, her hands resting on the edge of the sorting table, her eyes on the rain-beaded window. The robin had moved from the woodshed and was now perched on the sill outside, its feathers fluffed, its head cocked, as if listening to the sounds within. The light was reluctant to brighten, staying in a state of early morning grey that made the copper gleam dully and the white sheets glow like snow in a dusk landscape. Then Harlow pushed herself away from the table, walked to the woodpile, and knelt down to begin laying the kindling in the grate, because the copper needed fire, and the fire needed tending, and the whole long, slow, quiet process of boiling the sheets was ready to begin. Kneeling at the cold hearth felt like the start of a long and patient conversation, one Harlow had held with this fireplace on more mornings than she could count. The stones around the grate still held a faint memory of yesterday's chill, a deep coolness that rose from the earth beneath the flagstones and seeped into the wool of her skirt where her knees touched the floor. She reached into the willow basket and drew out a handful of wood shavings, fine curls of pine and oak that the garden boy had planed from a beam in the carpenter's shed, their edges thin enough to catch a spark from the first match. The shavings rustled as they fell into a loose nest at the center of the iron grate, and she shaped them with her fingers into a small mound, leaving air channels for the flame to breathe. The light through the rain-streaked window was still the soft grey of a sun that would not show itself, and the copper boiler loomed above her, dark and silent, its wide mouth open to the ceiling. After the shavings came the kindling. Harlow selected small sticks from a wooden box, each one no thicker than her thumb, cut from willow and hazel that had been pruned from the hedgerows in early spring and dried under the eaves of the woodshed for just this purpose. She laid them across the shavings in a criss-cross pattern, building a small lattice that would hold the larger wood until the fire grew strong enough to take it on its own. Her movements were unhurried, each stick placed with a soft click against its neighbor, the pile slowly rising into a teepee shape that looked as natural as a bird's nest. The willow sticks were smooth and pale, their bark peeling in fine silver curls that drifted down onto the hearthstones when she handled them, and the smell they gave off was the dry, papery scent of old wood warmed by nothing but the air. The rain had not paused even for a moment, filling the washhouse with its constant low music. Against the roof it drummed in a soft roar, the slates running with water that found its way into the gutter and then down the drainpipe with a gurgle that rose and fell as the downpour shifted. Outside the window, the cobbled yard had disappeared beneath a sheen of standing water, the puddles spreading and joining into a shallow lake that reflected the grey clouds in trembling patches of silver. The robin had given up its perch on the sill and vanished into the ivy, and the only movement beyond the glass was the ceaseless streaking of raindrops. Inside, the washhouse felt cocooned by the weather, its stone walls thick enough to hold the quiet in, the air still expectant and cool except for the very small circle around Harlow where her body warmth lingered. When the kindling was arranged to her satisfaction, Harlow sat back on her heels and dusted her hands together, a small puff of wood dust falling to the floor. She reached for the coal scuttle and drew out a few lumps of the best Welsh coal that was kept for special use, the pieces glittering with seams of jet, their surfaces faceted like dark crystals. These she placed on top of a layer of small split logs of beech, their grain pale and pink-tinged, the wood dense enough to burn slowly and give a lasting heat. The coal would not catch at first, it needed the fire to be already established, a bed of glowing embers to ignite its deeper fire. But she arranged it now so that the architecture of the fire was complete, a tiered arrangement of shavings and kindling and logs and coal that would, once lit, transform itself from a small spark into a steady blaze that could heat the whole copper of water above it. The matches lived in a small tin box on the mantelpiece, a box painted with a faded picture of a sailing ship that had been there since before Harlow had come to the house as a girl. She rose, her knees clicking softly, and took the box down, shaking it near her ear to hear the rattle of the matchsticks inside. Opening it released a faint smell of sulphur, sharp and clean, and she selected a single match, its head a round blob of reddened chemical that looked like a tiny berry. She struck it against the rough side of the box with a single practiced motion, and the match flared into a yellow tongue of flame that wobbled gently as she brought it to the wood shavings. The first touch of fire to pine was almost silent. A soft fizz as the shavings began to darken and curl, and then a tiny blue-yellow flame appeared, as delicate as a petal, growing bolder as it found more fuel. Harlow watched the flame for a moment without moving, her face lit from below, the firelight catching the fine lines around her eyes and the silver threads in her brown hair. The flame ran along one of the willow sticks, its bark darkening and then breaking into a bright orange glow, and a small crack joined the sound of the rain, a tiny percussion that announced the fire's grip on the wood. She moved to blow gently at the base of the fire, not a hard breath, but a soft encouragement, and the embers glowed in answer, the shavings collapsing into a nest of orange sparks that climbed upward into the kindling lattice. Smoke, thin and grey, rose in a column toward the chimney, and the flue, still cold, drew it only slowly, so that a little of it curled into the room, carrying the sharp, clean scent of burning willow. As the fire grew, Harlow added a few more sticks of kindling, placing them slantwise against the growing flames, and then settled back to watch the process. The copper above the fire began to respond to the heat, its iron base expanding with a low, deep tick that echoed softly in the washhouse. Another tick followed, then a series of small pings as the metal found its new shape under the warmth. And these sounds were so familiar to Harlow that she would not have noticed them if she had not been listening for them. The copper's own way of saying it was ready for the work ahead. The firelight danced on the soot-blackened bricks at the back of the hearth, painting shifting shadows that moved like water, and the whole room gradually began to feel less like a cold stone cave and more like a living space, a place of warmth and purpose. With the fire crackling steadily, Harlow rose to fetch the first bucket of water. Her boots made soft sounds on the flagstones as she walked to the corner where the pump stood, the iron pump with its green paint flaking like old leaves. The bucket she lifted was made of oak, bound with brass bands that had turned a dull brown over the years, its handle worn smooth from countless trips across this floor. She primed the pump with a little water from the dipper, working the handle up and down, and the cold spring water gushed out with a clean, mineral smell, splashing into the bucket with a hollow sound that seemed louder in the quiet of the rain-filled room. The water was so cold that the bucket's sides immediately beaded with condensation, and Harlow's fingers tingled as she carried it back to the fire, the weight tugging at her arm in a way that was entirely ordinary. She set the bucket on the hearth, the water sloshing gently, and took down a long-handled copper ladle from its hook on the wall. With the ladle, she scooped water from the bucket and tipped it into the copper boiler, the first splash hitting the iron bottom with a hiss that was not steam, but simply the sound of cold water meeting warm metal. The water spread across the bottom of the boiler, a shallow pool that reflected the firelight in wavering golden patterns, and she continued scooping and pouring until the bucket was empty, then went back for another. The rain fell, the fire crackled, and Harlow walked between pump and copper with the same steady rhythm, her thoughts apparently nowhere in particular, her face as calm as the surface of a pond. After a time she paused and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a small smudge of ash on her skin, and looked out the window at the unchanging grey sky. The yard was a sheet of water now, and the sound of the rain had settled into a steady hiss that seemed to be part of the very air. She added a split log of ash to the fire, pushing it into place with the iron poker, and the flames responded by brightening, their orange and yellow cores dancing higher. The fire was now hot enough to make the copper hum, a low vibration that she could feel through the soles of her boots when she stood close, and the water inside the boiler was beginning to show signs of warmth, a few wisps of steam curling from its surface like breath on a cold morning. Harlow took up her station on a low wooden stool that she kept near the hearth, and sat for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, watching the flames. The work of building a fire was never truly finished at the moment of lighting. It required tending throughout the day, small adjustments, the addition of a piece of wood here or a lump of coal there, the occasional stir of the embers with the poker. But this first stage, the kindling and the catching, was the one she liked best. The moment when the cold raw materials of wood and coal and air transformed into something living and bright. Outside, the rain poured down without any sign of stopping, and the washhouse was filled with the smell of wood smoke and damp stone, and the faint, clean perfume of the spring water in the bucket. And the whole world seemed to have narrowed to this one small room, this one sheltered space where a fire burned and a woman waited for water to boil. She did not need to wait idly. There were small tasks to fill the time, and Harlow was not one to sit still for long. She fetched a broom made of twigs and swept the area around the hearth, gathering a little soot and some wood bark into a dustpan, then carried it to the bin by the door. She checked the sheets stacked on the table, smoothing out a fold that had worked itself into a crease, and ran her thumb over the mended pillowcase to be sure the stitches held. The rain against the window showed no sign of relenting. If anything, it was falling harder, the drops on the glass now running in constant streams that turned the view of the yard into a blur of green and grey. The robin had returned to the windowsill, its tiny feathers fluffed against the wet, and Harlow nodded at it as if greeting an old acquaintance. When the water in the copper began to simmer, a gentle trembling on its surface that sent ripples in concentric circles, Harlow knew the time had come to add the soap. She took down a wooden box from a shelf near the beam, its lid carved with the letter S in a simple script, and inside lay bars of Castile soap, pale green and slightly oily to the touch. She selected one bar and shaved curls from it with a small knife, the soap peeling away in thin ribbons that fell into a wooden bowl. The smell of the soap was clean and soft, with an undertone of olive oil, and as she worked, the ribbons piled up like grated cheese, ready to be stirred into the heating water. The rain drummed on, the fire murmured to itself, and Harlow shaved soap with the same slow patience she brought to every task, the blade moving steadily across the bar, the curls tumbling into the bowl, the copper beginning to steam in earnest now, the whole washhouse filling with warmth and the promise of boiling water. With the fire established and the first threads of steam beginning to uncurl from the copper's wide mouth, Harlow turned her attention to the task that would occupy the next long stretch of the morning, the filling of the boiler. The copper, for all its great size, was an empty vessel still, holding only the few inches of water she had already ladled in, a shallow pool that trembled with the heat rising from the iron bottom. The real work of washday could not begin until the water reached the proper level, high enough to cover the sheets completely, and allow them to move freely in the boil. And reaching that level meant many journeys between the pump and the hearth, each one slow and steady and requiring nothing more than the simple act of carrying water. She took up the first of the oak buckets that stood waiting near the pump, the same bucket she had used earlier, its brass bands cool against her palm, though the room was warming now. At the pump, she worked the iron handle with both hands, the motion as familiar as breathing, the downward push against resistance, the upward pull that drew the water from deep underground, the sudden gush as the cold spring water poured from the spout in a silver stream that splashed against the bucket's wooden sides. The sound of the pump was a rhythmic creak and splash, a small domestic music that joined the rain's steady drumming on the roof, and the water itself came out so cold that it seemed to carry its own pale light, a clarity born of chalk hills and underground streams. When the bucket was full enough to be heavy but not so full that it would slosh over, she lifted it by the handle and turned back toward the copper. The walk across the flagstones was no more than 15 steps, a path she had worn smooth over the years, and she took it without haste, the bucket swinging gently at her side. The weight tugged at her shoulder and arm with a familiar ache, and she shifted her grip slightly to balance the load, her boots making soft, even sounds on the stone. At the hearth, she set the bucket down on the raised brick step and lifted the long-handled copper ladle from its hook on the wall, the metal of the ladle warm now from the fire's nearness. She dipped the ladle into the bucket and began to transfer the water to the boiler, each scoop tipping in with a hollow splash that echoed upward into the copper's dark throat and then fell back into silence. The water level inside the boiler was low enough still that each ladleful spread out thinly over the hot iron bottom, producing a faint hiss that quickly faded as the new water warmed, and she worked through the whole bucket in this way before returning to the pump for the next one. The rain outside had settled into a steady, humming downpour, its sound so continuous that it had become less a noise and more a texture to the air, a soft pressure against the eardrums that you ceased to notice, except when it changed. Every now and then, a gust of wind would drive a heavier sheet of rain against the leaded window, rattling the small panes in their frames and sending a brief, louder drum roll across the roof slates. And then the wind would drop, and the rain would fall straight again, whispering into the puddles and the water butt and the leaves of the climbing rose that clung to the washhouse wall. Through the window, the world outside was a watercolor of grey and green. The shapes of the yard and the stable block and the distant elms all softened into indistinct blurs, as if seen through a pane of frosted glass. Inside, the washhouse remained its own small universe, lit by the amber glow of the fire and filled with the sounds of water and flame and the occasional creak of the old oak beam overhead. Harlow made trip after trip, and the copper level rose inch by slow inch. Each time she returned from the pump, the bucket seemed to grow a little heavier, and each time she ladled the water in, the sound of the splashing altered slightly as the depth increased. The water near the bottom of the boiler had begun to shimmer with heat, tiny currents moving through it in lazy spirals that caught the firelight and threw shifting patterns onto the copper's inner walls, while the newly added water remained cooler and still, creating a visible boundary between the warmed and the fresh. This boundary shifted and blurred as the two temperatures mingled, the cooler water sinking slowly and then rising again as it absorbed the heat from below, a quiet dance that Harlow watched without any particular thought, simply observing because it was there to be observed. When she had emptied 6 buckets into the copper and the water had climbed to roughly half the vessel's height, she paused to add the soap. The wooden bowl of shaved Castile curls sat on the sorting table where she had left it, the pale green ribbons now slightly drier at the edges, but still soft and oily to the touch. She carried the bowl to the copper and began to sprinkle the soap shavings onto the water's surface, distributing them in a slow, scattered rain. The curls landed with tiny plips and floated for a moment before the warmth began to melt them, their edges blurring and softening, their greenish tint fading into the water as they dissolved. A faintly sweet, clean scent rose with the steam, the smell of olive oil and soda, and the particular freshness that Castile soap always carried, and it mixed with the wood smoke and the mineral tang of the spring water to create a perfume that was, to Harlow, the signature of a washday properly begun. She took up the long wooden paddle that stood propped against the chimney breast, its handle worn to a silky smoothness by the grip of many hands over many years, and lowered it into the water. The paddle was made of beech, light and strong, and its blade was broad and flat with a slight curve that made it perfect for stirring. Harlow began to move it through the water in a slow figure-8 pattern, the paddle pushing the water ahead of it and drawing a gentle whirlpool that spiraled outward to lap against the copper's sides. The soap shavings that had not yet dissolved were caught in the current and pulled under, their forms disappearing into the cloudy swirl, and the whole surface of the water began to take on a slightly milky appearance, a softness of color that spoke of cleanliness. She stirred without hurry, her arm moving in a steady rhythm, and the paddle made a quiet sloshing sound against the water, a sound as rhythmic as the rain and almost as soothing. The fire, meanwhile, had settled into a steady burn. The logs of beech had caught fully now and were glowing with a deep orange heat, their bark curling back in blackened scrolls, and the lumps of coal she had added earlier had finally ignited, their surfaces cracking open to reveal cores of brilliant red that pulsed with a fiercer warmth. The flames no longer danced as wildly as they had when the fire was new. They had matured into a solid bed of embers, with occasional tongues of yellow that licked up around the copper's base, and the heat they gave off was a constant, radiant presence that could be felt several feet away. Harlow's face was flushed from the warmth, and the wool of her sleeves had absorbed the heat, so that her arms felt wrapped in a comforting weight, and the metal of the ladle and the paddle and the copper itself were all warm now, no longer cold to the touch but alive with the fire's energy. She returned to the pump for more water, the endless task of filling continuing with the same patient rhythm. The copper was still only half full, and the sheets waiting on the table would need a generous depth of water to swim in, enough to be fully submerged and to allow the boiling action to work through every fiber. Each new bucket she brought added perhaps 2 inches to the level, and the copper took it all with a deep, hollow note that seemed to come from somewhere underground. As the water climbed higher, the sound of the ladle pouring in changed again, becoming less of a splash and more of a deep plosh, the water's surface now well above the copper's curved bottom and into the wider belly of the vessel. The steam had thickened too, no longer just a few wisps, but a steady column of white vapor that rose toward the ceiling beam and spread out in a soft haze around the dried herbs that hung there. The rosemary and lavender bundles absorbed the moisture and gave back their fragrance, so that the air near the ceiling smelled of a garden in summer, a strange and lovely contrast to the grey rain pelting the window. Harlow was aware of the morning passing not by any clock. There was no clock in the washhouse, only the sun and the bells of the parish church a mile away, but by the gradual changes in the light and the deepening warmth of the room. The grey light through the window had shifted from the pale, milky tone of early morning to the fuller, slightly brighter grey of mid-morning, though the clouds showed no sign of breaking. The rain had eased a little, its roaring diminished to a steady whisper, and the gurgle of the drainpipe had slowed to a trickle. A pair of housemaids crossed the yard, visible briefly through the rain-streaked window as two dark shapes hurrying with aprons over their heads, their laughter carried away by the wet air before it could reach the washhouse door. Then they were gone, and the yard was empty again, and the only movement was the falling rain and the steam rising from the copper. She added the last of the soap shavings, scraping the wooden bowl with her finger to get every curl, and then she worked the paddle through the water once more, stirring the whole deep content of the boiler until the water was uniformly cloudy and fragrant. The paddle moved more slowly now that the boiler was nearly full, the resistance of the water greater, and each stroke required a gentle push from her shoulder and back, a motion that she settled into with the ease of long practice. The paddle's blade traced its figure eight, and the water followed, and the steam rose, and the rain fell, and time passed in the way it does when one is absorbed in simple, repetitive work. When at last the copper was full enough to satisfy her, the water level sitting a hand's span below the rim, Harlow straightened and rested the paddle against the chimney breast, its handle dripping onto the hearthstones in small dark spots that dried almost at once. She stood for a moment, her hands on her hips, looking into the steaming water, and she felt the tiredness in her arms and back that came from the lifting and carrying, a tiredness that was not unpleasant, but rather a sign of work well begun. The fire needed another log, so she selected a piece of ash from the woodpile and added it carefully, using the tongs to position it where the flames could reach it best. And then she settled onto her low stool beside the hearth to let the water come to the boil. The sound of the rain had become by now so much a part of the washhouse that it was like the beating of a heart, constant and unnoticed except in its absence. It mingled with the soft crackle of the fire and the low liquid murmur of the water heating in the copper, a trio of sounds that wove together into a fabric of quiet noise. Harlow listened without listening, her gaze resting on the flames, her hands folded loosely in her lap. The copper ticked and pinged as it expanded further, its iron seams groaning softly under the strain of the heat, and a single droplet of condensed steam ran down the outside of its curved belly before evaporating into the warm air. The herbs overhead swayed slightly in the steam, and a spider that had built a web between two of the bundles went about its tiny business, untroubled by the human activity below. She thought of nothing in particular, which is to say, she thought of everything that makes up a life. The texture of the wool under her fingers, the taste of the tea she would drink later, the way the light fell on the flagstones, the fact that the garden would be grateful for this rain after the dry spell of the previous week. Her mind drifted in the way that minds do when the body is occupied with a familiar task, touching on small memories and impressions and letting them go again, none of them urgent or demanding. The water in the copper began to simmer, tiny bubbles forming at the edges where the iron was hottest, and detaching themselves to float upward through the cloudy, soapy water, and the simmer made a gentle sound like a whispered conversation, many small voices speaking at once. The morning lengthened, and the copper's deep throat held the water that had travelled from the chalk spring underground, carried bucket by bucket across the flagstones, and now rested warm and ready under its blanket of steam. Harlow rose from the stool to check the water temperature, dipping the paddle in and watching the liquid sheet off its smooth blade, the droplets catching the firelight like little jewels before falling back. The water was nearly at a boil, the simmer becoming more agitated, the surface rippling with the energy of the heat beneath, and the smell of the Castile soap had grown stronger, filling the washhouse with a clean, old-fashioned perfume that promised the sheets would emerge from their bath as white as new snow. She nodded to herself, a small private gesture of readiness, and turned her eyes toward the stack of folded linen waiting on the sorting table. The filling was done, the water was hot, and the next step of the long process could begin whenever she chose to start it, for there was no schedule here, only the quiet rhythm of the day and the rain. By the time the water in the copper had reached a true rolling boil, the washhouse had transformed into a world of steam and soft thunder. The surface of the water no longer trembled. It churned with a steady, rhythmic energy, great globes of bubbles rising from the bottom and breaking open with wet, plosive sounds that joined the crackle of the fire and the ever-present drumming of the rain. A thick column of steam rose from the copper's wide mouth, curling upward to meet the oak beam before spreading out in a warm fog that misted the window glass and beaded on the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The whole room smelled of hot metal and clean water and the faint olive oil scent of the Castile soap that had long since dissolved into a milky cloud, and Harlow stood beside the copper with her long wooden paddle in hand, ready to begin the slow work of feeding in the sheets. You might have watched her from the doorway, shielded from the steam by nothing more than the thickness of the air, as she lifted the first sheet from the stack on the sorting table. It was the fine percale from the master's bed, the one with the embroidered monogram, and she shook it out with a single practiced motion that opened the fabric into a broad white expanse, like a cloud falling softly from her hands. The sheet rustled with a crisp sound, still holding a trace of lavender from the press, and then Harlow began to lower it into the copper foot by foot, the fabric touching the boiling water with a sharp intake of sound, a sizzle that was not quite steam and not quite hiss, but something in between, the meeting of cold, dry cotton with blistering heat. The sheet resisted at first, wanting to float on the surface because of the air trapped in its weave, and Harlow used the paddle to press it down gently, the wooden blade sliding under the cloth and guiding it into the depths. Bubbles rose around the fabric in a furious rush, their sound altering as the cotton drank in the hot water and surrendered its stiffness, and the sheet began to undulate like a living thing, billowing and folding in slow motion beneath the churning surface. Harlow kept her hand steady on the paddle handle, her eyes watching the fabric's progress, her face calm and a little flushed from the heat that radiated off the copper in waves. The steam condensed on her eyelashes in tiny pearls, and she blinked slowly, the motion as unhurried as everything else she did, while the rain beat its endless soft rhythm on the slates above. Once the first sheet was fully submerged, she gave the water a long, slow stir, tracing a figure 8 through the boiling depths that caught the sheet in a gentle whirlpool and pulled it under completely. The fabric billowed open like a flower blooming in reverse, its folds loosening as the boiling water penetrated every thread, and the faint grey tint that had marked the well-used linen began to lift away almost immediately, spreading into the surrounding water as a thin discoloration too faint to see unless you watched very closely. The soap, now thoroughly mixed with the boil, helped to carry away the impurities, and a thin foam of bubbles gathered at the edges of the copper, pale and fleeting, breaking against the iron rim in tiny pops. Harlow used the paddle to push the foam aside, clearing a space on the surface so she could see the water beneath, and then she turned back to the table for the next sheet. The second sheet was one of the coarser linens from the nursery, still bearing the faint milk stain near the corner that had caught her eye during sorting. She unfolded it with care, the fabric heavier and less fine than the master's percale, its texture rough enough to make a soft rasping sound as she gathered it into her arms. Lowering it into the copper took a little more effort because of its weight, and she leaned forward slightly, the heat warming her face to a glow as the water accepted the new sheet with a fresh surge of bubbles and steam. The stain would need the full boil to release properly, and Harlow trusted the process entirely, knowing from decades of washdays that the combination of hot water and soap and thyme could undo almost anything that a household could impose on its linen. She pressed the sheet down with the paddle, watching the fabric twist and coil in the boiling current, and then returned to stir the whole contents of the copper in a wide, slow circle that combined the new sheet with the old, setting both to simmering together. The rain, which had been steady all morning, now began to fall with renewed vigor, a heavier downpour that rattled the window panes in their lead frames and sent a spray of water splashing up from the cobbles outside. The sound of it filled the washhouse like a blanket, softening every other noise so that the crackle of the fire and the bubbling of the copper and the soft wet sounds of the paddle moving through water all felt muted and distant, as though heard through a layer of cotton wool. Harlow noticed the change in the weather without breaking her rhythm, glancing at the window only long enough to see the grey sky weeping its endless tears, and then returned her attention to the copper, where a third sheet was ready to be introduced to the boil. She lifted this one from the stack with the same unhurried motion, a pillowcase this time, its button now securely mended from her morning's needlework, the thread lying flat and even against the coffin. The pillowcase was small enough to slip into the water without the same slow lowering, but Harlow treated it with the same gentleness, dipping one corner in first and then allowing the rest to follow, the fabric sliding beneath the foam and disappearing with a soft gulp. The bubbles responded with a fresh cascade of sound, and the steam rolled off the surface in thicker curls, filling her lungs with warm, moist air that tasted of clean laundry and hot metal. She stirred again, the paddle tracing its endless figure eight, the motion as soothing as the rain itself. A repetitive rhythm that asked nothing of her except patience and attention. As she worked, the copper slowly filled with cloth, the sheets intertwining beneath the surface like ghostly dancers, pale shapes that moved and turned in the boil. Harlow kept a careful eye on the water level, which rose only slightly with the addition of the fabric, and added a splash of cold water from the bucket once to keep the boil from growing too fierce. The cold water met the hot with a sharp hiss, steam flaring up in a brief cloud, and then the copper settled back into its steady churning, the bubbles reforming and the sheets continuing their slow underwater ballet. The paddle handle grew warm under her palms, the wood seasoned by years of handling, its surface polished to a dark sheen by the oils of her skin and the constant friction of water. She shifted her grip now and then, her fingers finding the familiar warm spots without needing to look. The low wooden stool near the hearth offered a place to rest when the rhythm allowed it, and Harlow settled onto it for a moment between sheets, the wool of her dress absorbing the warmth of the fire that still crackled in the grate. From her stool she could see the whole washhouse, the steaming copper, the rain-lashed window, the baskets of waiting linen, the bunches of rosemary dangling from the beam, and the small robin that had once again found its perch on the outer sill, its feathers dark with moisture as it peered in through the streaming glass. The room felt timeless in this moment, suspended in the grey light and the damp air, a place where nothing existed except the fire and the water and the cloth and the rain, and Harlow allowed herself a slow, deep breath that lifted her shoulders and let them fall, the only answer to the quiet around her. The next sheet to go into the copper was another of the coarse nursery linens, this one so large that it took both her arms to manage, the fabric billowing out around her like a sail before she tamed it into a manageable bundle. She fed it into the water corner by corner, the boil greeting each new section with its characteristic sizzle, the bubbles clustering around the cloth as it sank. The paddle was needed here more than before, the sheet's stubborn tendency to float, requiring a firm, patient pressure to subdue, and Harlow leaned into the work with the whole weight of her small frame, the muscles of her forearms tightening under the rolled-up sleeves. The cloth gave way at last, slipping beneath the foam with a satisfied gulp, and the copper accepted it into the general swirl of fabric and water, the whole mass now beginning to look like a great pot of simmering white stew. A fine grey foam gathered more thickly now on the surface, the impurities of the week's sleep lifting from the sheets and forming a scum that slid along the edges of the copper in greasy swirls. Harlow reached for her skimming ladle, a flat tin spoon with a long handle that hung on a hook beside the paddle, and began to lift the foam away, tipping it into a wooden pail at her feet. The motion was slow and deliberate, the ladle dipping into the bubbles with a soft clink, the foam sliding off into the pail with a wet sigh, and she worked her way around the entire rim of the copper, clearing the surface inch by inch. Each dip of the ladle revealed a little more of the boiling water beneath, the sheets visible through the steam as pale ghosts turning and folding, and the smell of hot, clean cotton grew stronger with every passing minute. Between skimming and stirring, Harlow added another log to the fire, a solid piece of oak that she nudged into the heart of the blaze with the iron poker so that the flames caught immediately, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The fire roared gently, its sound blending with the rain and the bubbling water, and the copper ticked and pinged as the metal continued to expand under the heat. The warmth in the washhouse was now intense, a humid blanket that made the cool corners of the room seem distant and unreal, and Harlow wiped a trickle of perspiration from her temple with the corner of her apron, the cotton coming away damp. She pulled the stool a little farther from the hearth and sat again, the paddle resting across her knees, the ladle in its hook, waiting. The last of the sheets, a pair of small pillowcases and a folded tablecloth from the breakfast room that someone had tucked into the basket by mistake, went into the copper with the same gentle attention as the first. Harlow slipped them one by one into the bubbling brew, watching each piece disappear beneath the foam, and then gave the whole copper a final long stirring that set the contents swirling in a slow clockwise whirlpool. She lifted the paddle and turned it over in her hands, inspecting the wood for any sign of wear, finding none, and then propped it back against the brick wall where it had stood that morning. The copper now held everything it needed to hold, and the long simmer could begin, the boil doing its quiet work on the fabric, while Harlow sat on her stool and listened to the rain and the fire and the steady blup-blup of heated water, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her thoughts drifting like the steam toward the rafters. Once the sheets had been simmering for a time, and the water had accepted them fully into its heat, a change began to show on the surface of the boil. It came first as a slight cloudiness at the edges, a faint greyish bloom that gathered where the bubbles were most active near the copper's sides, and then it spread inward in thin, filmy patches that caught the light differently from the clean, soapy water beneath. Harlow recognized this as the sign that the linens were giving up their week of use. The dust and the body oils and the tiny, invisible particles of sleep loosening from the cotton weave and rising to the top to be carried away. The scum was not unpleasant, merely the evidence of things that had finished their purpose and now needed to be removed, and she had been waiting for it with the patience of someone who knows a process cannot be rushed. She took down the skimming ladle from its hook beside the hearth, a flat tin scoop with a long handle of polished ash. The metal of its bowl darkened to a dull pewter from years of passing through hot water. The handle was warm from hanging so near the fire, and it fit her palm as comfortably as a doorknob. She carried the ladle to the copper and looked into the steaming water, seeing the grey film shiver and drift with the movement of the boil, and she set a clean wooden pail on the stones beside her feet to receive what she lifted away. The pail was an old one, its staves held together by iron bands that had rusted to a deep brown, and inside it smelled faintly of the many wash days it had witnessed. The skimming motion was one she had learned so long ago that she could not remember being taught, a smooth sweep of the ladle just beneath the surface that captured the foam without taking too much of the water with it. She dipped the tin bowl at a shallow angle, letting the grey scum slide into it with a soft, wet sigh, and then she lifted it clear and tapped it gently against the rim of the pail to dislodge the contents. The foam fell into the bucket with a sound like a whisper folding into itself, a quiet little splut that was swallowed by the pail's wooden hollow. She repeated the motion, the ladle moving in a slow arc from one side of the copper to the other, gathering the film in thin, patient strokes that never hurried, never splashed, never disturbed the sheets more than they needed to be disturbed. The rain outside, which had been a constant companion since before dawn, continued to fall with a steady, gentle hiss, its rhythm so deeply embedded in the air that it felt like a silence rather than a sound. The drops ran down the window in slow, meandering paths, each one taking its own time to join its neighbours and slide into the frame, and the grey light that filtered through them was calm and unchanging. The robin had returned to the outside sill, its small body a dark shape against the watery glass, and from somewhere in the wisteria that climbed the washhouse wall came the distant, sleepy murmur of a thrush, a bird that sang even in the rain because the rain was all it knew. These sounds blended together into a soft tapestry behind the nearer noises of the washhouse, the crackle of the fire and the slosh of the water and the gentle rhythmic scrape of the ladle against the copper's edge. Between each round of skimming, Harlow would pause to stir the sheets. She laid the ladle across the pail's rim and took up the long beechwood paddle, lowering it into the water and beginning a slow figure eight that moved the fabric beneath the surface in smooth, heavy folds. The sheets, now softened by the boil and heavy with water, billowed around the paddle's blade like pale ghosts caught in a slow current, their whiteness turning and folding, their hems trailing lazily through the soapy broth. The paddle made a soft sloshing sound as it pushed the water, and the water made a deeper, liquid murmur as it met the copper's curved wall and folded back upon itself, a quiet conversation between wood and metal and cloth. Harlow's arm moved with the steadiness of a clock pendulum, her shoulder and elbow describing the same easy circle again and again, her breath slow and even in the warm, steamy air. The steam that rose from the copper was thick now, filling the washhouse with a blanket of moist warmth that condensed on every cool surface it could find. Tiny droplets formed on the iron hooks that hung from the oak beam, on the dried herb bundles that swayed gently overhead, on the glass of the window where they joined the rain streaks in a double layer of water. Some of these droplets grew heavy enough to fall, and every so often a single drop would plink back into the copper with a miniature splash, a sound so small and precise that it was like a punctuation mark in the long sentence of the rain. The steam condensed on Harlow's lashes too, beading there until she blinked them away, and it gathered on the wool of her shawl where it hung on its peg, darkening the fabric as if the rain itself had come indoors to rest. She returned to the skimming ladle, lifting it again and taking another thin layer of grey foam from the water's surface. The scum had thinned since her first pass, no longer a solid film, but a scattering of small grey clusters that drifted here and there like clouds across a miniature sky, and the ladle's task was now one of patience and precision, seeking out each small patch and scooping it away. The water beneath was growing clearer with every pass, its milky soapiness giving way to a clean transparency through which the pale shapes of the sheets could be seen more distinctly, their folds and wrinkles visible now in soft undulations. The firelight, which had sunk to a deep orange glow in the hearth, reflected off the water's surface in shimmering lines that shifted and bent with the currents from the paddle, painting the copper's inside with a moving pattern of light and shadow. Harlow's mind, freed from any need to make decisions or to rush, had settled into the same slow rhythm as her hands. She thought of other washdays, years of them stretching back like a long straight road through a calm landscape, each one the same in its essentials and each one slightly different in its small details, the particular shade of grey of the sky, the weight of the rain, the song of the thrush that had nested in the wisteria every spring for as long as she could remember. She thought of the copper and how it had been new once, its sides bright and shining, and how it had darkened over the decades into the deep mottled colour of old bronze, like a piece of the earth that had been shaped by human hands and then allowed to grow its own skin of age. She thought of nothing that required an answer, only a gentle drifting of impressions that passed through her like the steam through the herbs overhead. The fire, which had been burning steadily for hours now, needed another log to keep its strength. Harlow set the ladle aside and went to the woodpile, selecting a solid piece of ash with a curve of bark still attached, the bark rough and silvery against her fingers. She carried it to the hearth and, using the toe of her boot, nudged it into the bed of embers, watching as the orange glow brightened around the new fuel and small flames began to lick along its edges. The log shifted as it caught, settling into the grate with a soft crunch, and a shower of sparks rose up the chimney like a handful of tiny stars that faded before they could travel very far. The fresh warmth from the fire reached her face and hands, and she stood for a moment simply feeling it, her eyes half closed against the brightness. When she returned to the copper, the water had boiled a little harder in her absence, the bubbles coming faster and with more force, and the sheets had shifted themselves around in the currents. She took up the paddle and stirred them back into an orderly arrangement, the figure-eight motion calming the surface and distributing the heat evenly through the deep belly of the boiler. The ladle waited patiently on the pail, and after a few more minutes of stirring, she exchanged paddle for ladle and went back to skimming the few remaining traces of grey that had risen while she was busy. The scum was nearly gone now, only the faintest suggestion of it appearing at the edges, and the water had become beautifully clear, the soap having done all its work and been dissolved into the steam. The sounds of the washhouse had settled into a pattern so regular that they had ceased to be individual noises and had become instead a single blended hum of industry and weather. The rain's whisper, the fire's quiet crackle, the gentle slosh of the paddle, the soft plink of the dripping condensate, and the distant murmur of the thrush all wove together into a fabric of sound that lay over the room like a blanket. Even the scratch of the ladle against the copper's rim had its place, a small, sharp note that punctuated the otherwise liquid texture of the morning. Harlow worked within this soundscape as a fish swims in water, entirely at home, entirely unthinking, only doing and being. Time passed without measure, the grey light through the window neither brightening nor dimming as the hidden sun climbed its invisible arc behind the clouds. The robin on the sill preened its wet feathers, drawing each one through its beak with a tiny, meticulous motion, and the thrush in the wisteria fell silent for a while and then began again. Its song a series of liquid notes that seemed to be asking a question that never needed an answer. Harlow's wooden pail had collected a small layer of grey foam at its bottom, the scum slowly settling into a watery sludge that she would later pour into the garden where the rose bushes would absorb whatever faint nutrients it still held. The paddle hung dripping on its hook, and the ladle rested in the pail, and the sheets boiled on in their copper bath, turning from cream to white as the minutes accumulated. She stood at the copper and looked down into the water, seeing the sheets floating now in a perfectly clear medium, their weave visible even through the steam, their monograms readable where they drifted near the surface. The boil was strong enough to keep them moving, a gentle tumble that turned this side and then that side to the heat, and the clean smell of hot cotton had replaced the earlier scent of soap. This was the moment when the washing was truly done, when nothing more was needed but the careful lifting and the rinsing. A moment that Harlow always recognized with a quiet sense of something that was not quite satisfaction, but rather a simple acknowledgement that the middle of the task had been reached. She stirred the sheets one more time, making sure that no fold was trapped and no hem was tangled, and then she stepped back from the copper to let them simmer in their clear bath while she prepared the rinsing trough for the next stage. The rain, which had been a companion through all of this, showed no sign of ending, and Harlow was glad of it, for the sound of the rain made the silence that followed the boiling feel less empty. It filled the air with its soft, insistent presence, a reminder that the world outside was still there, still turning, still falling in a gentle, unbroken sheet from the clouds to the ground, and it would continue to fall while she carried the sheets to the trough, and while she rinsed them, and while she starched them, and while she hung them to dry. The washhouse had become a world unto itself, a small, warm cavern lit by fire and steam. And inside it, there was nothing but the slow, patient rhythm of a task that had begun before her, and would continue after, carried forward by the same steady hands and the same quiet sounds. The time for the sheets to leave the copper arrived not with any clock's announcement, but with a subtle shift in the steam and a particular clarity in the water that told Harlow the boiling had done all it could do. The fabric had been swimming for long enough that every fibre had opened to the heat, every stain had loosened and lifted, and the water itself remained clean and transparent, even after hours of simmering. She knew this moment in her bones, the same way she knew when bread was ready to come out of the oven by its smell, and she moved to the hearth with the calm certainty of someone who was not deciding but simply responding to a signal that had been given. Beside the chimney breast, propped in an iron stand she had made long ago from a barrel hoop, stood the two long wooden rods that were used only for this task. They were made of ash, each as tall as a walking stick and smoothly rounded, their ends slightly flattened into paddle shapes that could slide beneath the heavy wet fabric without tearing it. The wood had darkened over the years to the color of strong tea, and the parts that spent the most time underwater were polished to a silky gloss by the constant friction of wet cotton. Harlow lifted them from their stand, one in each hand, and held them for a moment, feeling their familiar weight and balance before she carried them to the copper. The steam rising from the boiler was still thick and warm, curling around her face and hands as she approached, and she had to peer through it to see the pale shapes of the sheets moving slowly in the currents below. The fire in the grate had been allowed to drop slightly, its flames no longer roaring, but settled into a deep bed of orange embers that gave off a steady, even heat without driving the water into a frantic boil. This gentler heat made the lifting easier, for the sheets would not thrash around as she drew them up, and she had timed the fire slowing with the same instinct that guided all her work, adding a little less wood in the last hour so that the copper would be calm when she needed it to be. She dipped the first rod into the water, sliding it down along the inside curve of the copper until it met the resistance of cloth, and then she hooked it gently under the nearest sheet, feeling for the fabric's edge through the wood, the way an angler feels for a fish through a line. The second rod followed, entering the water at a slightly different angle, and together they formed a cradle that could lift the soaked linen without tearing it. Harlow's hands were protected by a pair of thick woolen mitts she had pulled on before beginning, the wool already damp with steam and smelling faintly of lanolin, and she gripped the rods firmly, her knuckles pale beneath the woven fibre. The first sheet began to rise from the water, with a sound like a small waterfall running in reverse, the hot liquid streaming off the fabric in sheets and rivulets that splashed back into the copper, with a series of wet, slapping notes. The weight of the soaked linen was considerable, pulling against her arms and shoulders, and she leaned back slightly to counterbalance it, her boots planted solidly on the flagstones. The sheet emerged inch by inch, its whiteness astonishing against the dark interior of the boiler, the water pouring from its folds and hems in 1,000 tiny cascades that glittered in the firelight, and the steam thickened around it as the cooler air of the room met the scalding fabric, wrapping the whole scene in a temporary fog that softened every edge. Harlow raised the sheet until it cleared the copper's rim, then she pivoted slowly, the rods moving with her in a careful arc, and carried the dripping bundle across the short space to the large wooden draining board that stood beside the boiler. This board was a massive slab of beech, tilted slightly toward a groove cut into its lower edge, so that water would run off and drain back toward the central channel in the floor, and its surface was pale with years of scrubbing and grooved with faint wear marks where countless sheets had been laid before. She lowered the sheet onto it, the fabric landing with a soft, heavy thud, and then she slid the rods free, letting the linen settle into a steaming mound that spread slowly outward as the water drained from it. For a moment she paused, breathing the warm, clean air and feeling the slight tremor in her arms that came from bearing the weight. The sheet on the board was a marvel of transformation, its color now a pure, brilliant white that it had not possessed when dry, its weave relaxed and soft, the monogram at its hem standing out in crisp, wet lines. A shallow pool of hot, sudsy water was already spreading across the planks and running in a slow rivulet along the groove, making its way toward the central drain, where it would disappear with a quiet gurgle, and the steam rose from the fabric in lazy curls that drifted toward the ceiling beam and joined the general haze. Harlow wiped the rods on a cloth she kept for this purpose, drying them so they would not slip in her hands, and then she turned back to the copper for the next sheet. The second sheet was the coarse nursery linen, heavier even than the first, and it required a moment of careful positioning before she could get both rods securely beneath it. The water was deeper now that one sheet had been removed, and the remaining fabric had shifted to fill the space, tangling slightly with its neighbor so that she had to tease them apart with the tip of one rod, a delicate underwater motion that sent small swirls through the clear water. The tangles came free without resistance, the sheets separating like dancers who had been holding hands and now let go, and then she was able to slide the rods under and begin lifting, the weight settling onto her shoulders with a familiar downward pull. This sheet rose more slowly, the water draining from it in a different pattern because of the coarser weave, the streams breaking into droplets that pattered back into the copper like a brief, localized rain shower. The fabric was heavier and held more water, and by the time she had it clear of the rim, her arms were trembling with a fine, steady vibration that she ignored because she had felt it many times before and knew it would pass. She carried it to the draining board and laid it beside the first sheet, the two mounds of white linen steaming side by side like twin hills in a morning mist, and then she straightened and rolled her shoulders once, a small, private adjustment that no one saw. The copper was now noticeably emptier, the water level having dropped by several inches with the removal of the fabric, and the remaining sheets floated more freely in the reduced space. Harlow paused to add a splash of cold water from the bucket to the boiler, not enough to cool it significantly, but just enough to settle the surface and bring the temperature down a little for the next lift. The cold water met the hot with a quick, sharp hiss, a puff of steam flaring upward before the copper returned to its gentle simmer, and she stirred the contents once with the paddle to make sure the remaining sheets were not sticking to the iron bottom. The paddle moved through the water with less resistance now, the laundry inside the copper reduced and manageable. She lifted the third sheet, a pillowcase this time, so light after the heavy linens that it felt like lifting nothing at all, the rods barely dipping under its weight. Steam rolled off the small piece of fabric in a soft cloud, and she could see the neat stitches of her morning's mending, the thread holding true through the boil, the button still firmly attached, and this small evidence of work well done gave her a quiet sense of continuity. The mending and the boiling all part of a single unbroken thread of care. She laid the pillowcase on the board with the others, its small square shape a contrast to the billowing sheets, and then she went back for the next piece. The process continued at its own steady pace, each sheet lifted and carried and laid down, each one adding to the steaming mountain on the draining board. Between lifts, Harlow performed small maintenance tasks that kept the washhouse running. She wiped the rods, added a lump of coal to the fire, checked that the draining board's groove was not blocked by any loose thread, and once she went to the pump for a fresh bucket of cold water to replace the one she had drawn from. The rain outside continued its soft, endless percussion, now a light drizzle that tapped gently against the panes and ran in slow streaks down the outside of the glass. And the robin had been joined by a second robin, the two birds perched on the sill together, their feathers puffed against the damp. The thrush and the wisteria had fallen silent, perhaps napping, perhaps simply listening to the rain, like everything else. The draining board gradually filled with linen, each sheet lying in a loose, steaming fold that overlapped its neighbors, the collective warmth rising from them in a steady column of vapor that added to the washhouse's humid atmosphere. The water that ran from the board into the drain had slowed from a stream to a trickle, the sheets having released most of their excess moisture during the lifting, and now they simply steamed quietly, their surfaces glistening with a fine sheen of remaining water that would be pressed out in the next stage. Harlow ran her hand over one of the sheets, feeling its heat through her mitt. The fabric smooth and soft and entirely clean, bearing no trace of the grey scum she had skimmed away earlier, and the tactile confirmation was a small satisfaction that settled somewhere deep in her chest. When the last piece had been lifted from the copper tablecloth she had found at the bottom of the basket, forgotten until now, the boiler stood nearly empty, only a foot or so of hot soapy water remaining in its depths. The fire beneath it had burned down to a bed of glowing coals that cast a deep red light on the iron bottom, and the copper itself began to cool with a series of soft pinging ticks as the metal contracted slightly. Harlow set the rods back in their stand and pulled off her woolen mitts, laying them on the hearth to dry, and she looked at the draining board with its load of clean white linen, a silent tally of the morning's work that required no counting. The washhouse, which had been so full of the sounds of boiling and skimming and stirring, now settled into a quieter phase. The fire crackled softly to itself. The rain tapped on the roof and window, the draining board dripped into the groove with a faint, rhythmic plink, and the steam drifted upward toward the herbs that hung from the beam, their leaves now plump with absorbed moisture. The robins on the sill shifted their feet, tiny claws scratching against the stone, and one of them gave a brief liquid chirp that was swallowed almost immediately by the larger sound of the weather. Harlow stood for a moment, with her hands resting on the edge of the draining board, her face still flushed from the heat, her breathing slow and even, and she let the quiet of the room settle over her like a second apron, comfortable and familiar. There was still work to be done, the rinsing and the bluing and the starching and the mangling and the drying. But this moment, the moment after the lifting when the copper was empty and the sheets lay steaming in a heap, was a small plateau in the long climb of the day. She had carried the linen through the fire and the water, and it had come out clean, and now it rested before the next stage, as all things must rest between one effort and the next. The rain, which had seen all of this and would see all that followed, continued to fall from the grey sky with a patience equal to her own, filling the gutters and the water butt and the puddles in the cobbled yard, a soft, eternal sound that asked nothing and promised nothing, only fell and fell and fell. With the boiled sheets now lifted from the copper and resting in their steaming, dripping pile on the wooden draining board, Harlow turned her attention to the rinsing trough that stood along the far wall, a long, deep basin of grey stone that had been carved from a single block many years before the house was built. The trough was fed by a pipe of lead that came through the wall from the spring outside, and a constant flow of cold, clear water ran through it day and night, entering at one end with a soft, continuous gurgle, and leaving at the other through an overflow channel cut into the stone, from which it ran across the flagstones in a shallow, guided rivulet toward the central drain. The sound of this running water was a permanent feature of the washhouse, a quiet, liquid murmur that had been there when Harlow first entered the room that morning and would be there long after she left, as much a part of the place as the copper or the beam or the window that the rain still streaked with silver. The sheets, though boiled clean, were still heavy with soapy water that clung to every fibre, and the rinsing would take time and many changes of the cold water to draw out the last traces of the Castile soap. Harlow carried the first sheet from the draining board to the trough in both arms, the wet linen slapping softly against her apron and leaving a dark trail of moisture on the cotton, the weight of it pulling at her arms. She lowered the sheet into the trough's cold water with a slow, careful motion, the fabric spreading out beneath the surface like a pale bloom opening underwater. The shock of the cold water meeting the still warm linen produced a faint, momentary cloud of milkiness, the residual soap releasing from the weave in soft, swirling wisps that drifted toward the overflow and were carried away before they could settle. The water in the trough, which had been perfectly clear a moment before, now ran with a delicate pearlescent haze that gradually thinned and vanished as the flow continued. She began to work the sheet with her hands, a motion that was neither kneading nor wringing, but something in between, a firm, rhythmic pressing of the fabric against itself under the water, lifting it slightly and then submerging it again, rubbing one fold against another to encourage the cold water to penetrate every thread. Her hands, reddened by the heat of the copper, and now plunged into the icy spring water, tingled with the change in temperature, and the skin of her knuckles tightened into small wrinkles that would smooth out later when the work was done. The cold was sharp but not unpleasant, a clean, bracing sensation that kept her alert, and the sound of the water splashing softly against the stone sides of the trough mixed with the constant gurgle of the inflow pipe and the distant, steady hiss of the rain. The rinsing of a single sheet was not a quick task. Harlow would hold the fabric under the running water at one point, watching the stream pour through the weave and come out the other side, carrying faint traces of soap, and then she would shift the sheet along, moving it inch by inch through her hands, so that every section received the full force of the flow. She worked from one end to the other with the same patient, methodical rhythm she had brought to every task that day, her eyes following the movement of the water through the cloth, her mind quiet and still. The sheet, which had been limp and heavy with soapy water, began to feel lighter and fresher under her fingers, the stiffness of the soap replaced by the soft, clean texture of purely wet cotton, and a new smell began to rise from the trough, the cool, earthy scent of spring water, and the faint meadow-like perfume of rinsed linen. When she judged that the first sheet had been rinsed sufficiently, she gathered it into her arms, letting the excess water stream back into the trough in a thin, silvery cascade, and carried it to the clean end of the sorting table, where a dry wooden board waited. There she spread it out flat, smoothing the wrinkles with her palms, and began to squeeze the remaining water from it by hand, a twisting motion that started at one corner and worked its way across, each turn of her wrists sending a fresh stream of cold water splattering onto the flagstones. The fabric made a soft, wet sound as she twisted it, a sort of muffled squelch that grew fainter as more water was expelled, and when she had finished, the sheet was a compact, damp bundle that weighed perhaps a quarter of what it had weighed when she lifted it from the copper. She set it aside on a pile of other rinsed sheets that would soon accumulate and returned to the trough for the next one. The rain outside had not ceased, though its intensity had shifted throughout the morning, rising and falling like the breathing of some enormous, gentle creature. At this moment, it was falling in a fine, steady drizzle, the sort of rain that hangs in the air almost like a mist and beads on every surface without making much sound. The window above the trough was coated in a silvery blur, the raindrops small and many, and the light that came through was soft and even, casting no shadows and giving everything in the washhouse a muted, gentle appearance. The robin on the outer sill shook its feathers now and then, each shake sending up a tiny puff of water droplets, and the thrush in the wisteria had fallen silent, perhaps sheltering deeper in the leaves where the rain could not reach. Harlow lifted the second sheet from the draining board and plunged it into the trough, the same sequence repeating with only the smallest variations. This was the coarser linen from the nursery, and its texture under the water was rougher, the weave more open and the fibers more stubborn in releasing their soap. She worked it with a little more pressure, the heels of her hands pressing firmly into the fabric, and the cold water accepted the extra soap with a fresh bloom of milkiness that the current quickly carried away. The smell of the nursery linen was slightly different from the master's percale, holding a faint, lingering trace of the children who slept under it. A clean, warm scent that even the boil had not entirely removed. And Harlow found this pleasant, a small reminder of the life that went on in the house above the washhouse. As each sheet was rinsed, squeezed, and added to the stack on the table, the pile of clean, damp linen grew steadily. The work was repetitive, but within that repetition was a kind of peace, a rhythm that allowed Harlow's thoughts to wander without ever straying very far. She noted the way the light on the water shifted as the clouds outside thickened and then thinned again, a subtle brightening that lasted only a few minutes before the grey returned. She noted the sound of the drain pipe, which had developed a small gurgle as the water from the overflowing trough ran into it, a sound like someone humming a low, tuneless note. She noted the growing ache in her shoulders and back, a familiar tiredness that was not yet exhaustion, but would be by the time the last sheet was hung to dry, and she adjusted her stance slightly, shifting her weight from one foot to the other to ease the strain. The trough water, despite the constant inflow from the spring, would sometimes grow slightly cloudy if she rinsed too many sheets without pausing, and so Harlow had developed the habit of rinsing 2 or 3 sheets and then stopping to let the water run clear for a few minutes while she attended to other small tasks. During one such pause, she took up the broom of twigs to sweep away the puddles that had formed around the trough and the draining board, her boots leaving dark prints on the flagstones that the broom quickly erased. She emptied the pail of skimmings into the slop bucket by the door, the grey foam sliding out with a wet sigh, and rinsed the pail under the pump before setting it back beside the hearth. The fire, which had been burning low, received another log, and the flames brightened and crackled as they found new fuel, sending fresh warmth into the room that was welcome after the cold of the rinsing trough. When the water was clear again and the fire was burning brightly, Harlow returned to the trough for the pillowcases and the breakfast room tablecloth that had found its way into the basket by accident. The pillowcases were small and easy to rinse, requiring only a few passes under the water and a gentle squeeze to release the soap, and she held them up to the grey light from the window to check for any remaining traces of suds, turning them this way and that until she was satisfied. The tablecloth was larger and more awkward, its corners trailing in the water and its hem catching the current in a way that made it billow like a sail, but she managed it with the same steady competence, her hands never faltering even when the wet fabric tried to slip away. The tablecloth, being of damask, had a different feel than the water, a smooth, almost slippery texture that was pleasant to the touch, and she took a moment to admire the pattern of leaves and vines that the water magnified before squeezing it dry and setting it with the others. The rinsing was a stage of the wash that Harlow had always found particularly satisfying, for it was here that the transformation from soiled to clean became complete. The boiled sheets had been stripped of their impurities, but the soap had left its own residue, and only the clear, cold spring water could carry that away and leave the linen truly fresh. She felt this freshness now as she plunged her hands into the trough again and again, the water numbing her fingertips and turning the skin of her palms to a soft, puckered pink. The sensation was not unpleasant, and she had long ago ceased to notice the cold except as a familiar companion to the work, as much a part of washday as the fire and the steam and the rain. Outside, the rain continued to fall with the same gentle persistence, a soft hissing that filled the spaces between the nearer sounds and made the washhouse feel like a small, sheltered cove in the midst of a vast, wet ocean. The clouds above were unchanging, a uniform blanket of grey that stretched from horizon to horizon, and the light that filtered through them was diffuse, shadowless, a light that seemed to come from everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. In this light, the white of the rinsed sheets took on a pale, luminous quality, like snow seen through a veil, and Harlow found the sight of them pleasing as she added each new sheet to the stack. The last sheet came from the draining board, and by now the water in the trough had run clear for so long that there was almost no soap left to rinse away. This final sheet, a fine percale with no monogram, was the one that had lain at the very bottom of the basket, the last to be sorted and the last to be boiled, and she lowered it into the cold water with a feeling of something quietly approaching its conclusion. The sheet floated for a moment, its surface tension resisting the water, and then it sank slowly, the fabric darkening as it absorbed the cold and released the final, faintest traces of soap. Harlow worked it through her hands one last time, the motion almost tender, and then she lifted it, squeezed it, and laid it on top of the stack with the others. The pile of rinsed, squeezed sheets sat on the table now, a mound of clean, damp linen that gave off a cool, fresh smell like a field after rain. The washhouse was quiet except for the running water in the trough, and the soft crackle of the fire, and the eternal whisper of the rain on the slates. Arlo dried her hands on a clean corner of her apron, the cotton leaving smears of water that quickly soaked in, and looked around the room to see that everything was in its proper place. The copper sat cooling on the hearth, its water still warm but no longer boiling, its surface calm and dark. The paddle and the skimming ladle hung on their hooks, the pails stood empty, the fire burned low and red in the grate. Outside the rain fell, and inside the sheets waited for the next step, the bluing and the starching that would give them their final crispness. But for this moment, the rinsing was done, and Harlow allowed herself a quiet, motionless pause, her hands resting on the edge of the trough, her eyes on the rain-bedded window, her breath slow and even in the cool, damp air. With the rinsing complete and the sheets lying in a cool, damp stack on the sorting table, Harlow turned to the delicate work that would give the linen its final brilliance and body, the twin processes of bluing and starching that separated a proper wash from a merely adequate one. The washhouse had grown quieter as the morning stretched toward afternoon. The fire in the grate settled into a deep, steady glow. The rain outside softened to a persistent mist that blurred the window without streaking it, and the only continuous sounds were the gentle gurgle of the spring water still running through the rinsing trough and the occasional tick of the cooling copper. The air, which had been thick with steam all morning, was now fresher and cooler, carrying the clean mineral scent of the spring water and the faint, dwindling perfume of the wood smoke that had long since stopped billowing and now merely breathed from the embers. Harlow crossed to the cupboard near the water pump, a small built-in press with a warped door that squeaked softly when she pulled it open, and reached inside for the articles she would need. There was a stoneware jar with a cork stopper, its surface glazed in a deep brown, and inside it held a fine powdered blue, the color of a summer evening sky just before the first star appears. This powder, made from indigo and a little starch to keep it dry, was the secret of white linen that seemed to glow in the candlelight of the upstairs rooms, for it deposited a faint invisible tint that tricked the eye into seeing a purer white by cancelling the slight yellowing that even the cleanest sheets acquired over time. Beside the jar stood a smaller glass bottle of liquid bluing, and next to that a wooden box of wheat starch, pale as fine flour and smelling faintly of the mill, and a small saucepan of tinned copper, dented at the rim, that was used only for cooking starch. She gathered these things into her apron, cradling them against her hip like a mother gathering eggs, and carried them to the work table that stood beneath the window. The first task was the bluing bath. At the end of the rinsing trough, where the water flowed quietest and the current did not disturb the surface, Harlow placed a clean wooden pail and let it fill halfway with the cold spring water that ran continuously from the pipe. The water in the pail was so clear that the grain of the wood at the bottom was visible in every detail, and it shivered slightly with the movement of the pail as she settled it on the flagstones. She unstoppered the stoneware jar and took out a small horn spoon that lived inside it, and with this she scooped up a tiny mound of the blue powder, no more than would sit on a child's fingernail, and held it over the water. The powder fell in a fine, dusty stream, its particles spreading on the surface for a moment before beginning to sink, and then she stirred it with a clean glass rod, the rod moving in slow circles that drew the blue down into the water and spread it outward in delicate, smoky swirls that faded gradually into the palest sky blue, a shade so faint it was almost a memory rather than a color. The bluing water, when she was satisfied with its tint, looked like the reflection of a clear February sky in a pond, and it smelled of nothing at all except the cool freshness of the spring. Arlo lifted the first sheet from the rinsed stack, the fabric still damp and heavy but no longer dripping, and she unfolded it with a soft rustle before lowering it into the bluing pail. The sheet entered the water with a gentle shush, the pale blue flowing over and through the white cotton, and she watched as the fabric absorbed the faint tint for only a few seconds before she lifted it out again, the water running back into the pail in clear, colorless streams that showed the blue had already fixed itself to the cloth. The sheet in her hands was perhaps a shade whiter than before, the change so subtle that no one could point to it, and yet anyone would notice the difference when the linen lay on the beds, a freshness that seemed to brighten the whole room. She worked through the stack of sheets one at a time, dipping each for a count of 5 before lifting it and giving it a gentle squeeze to remove the excess water, then laying it on a clean wooden railing she had set across 2 stools near the fire. The bluing pail grew no paler as she worked, the powder having dissolved thoroughly, and the sheets on the railing began to form a long white cascade that dripped slowly onto the flagstones, each drop leaving a tiny, temporary bloom of moisture that evaporated almost at once in the warmth from the hearth. The robin on the windowsill had been joined by a third bird, a small brown sparrow that had flown in out of the mist to share the narrow ledge, and the two of them perched together in silence, their feathers puffed, their eyes bright and unblinking as they watched the movements inside the washhouse. When all the sheets had passed through the bluing, Harlow emptied the pail into the drain with a splash and rinsed it under the pump before setting it aside to dry. Then she turned to the starch, which would require a little cooking to reach the right consistency for the linens. The small copper saucepan she placed on a trivet over the fire, pouring in a measure of cold water from the bucket, and while it heated, she took out a mixing bowl and spooned a quantity of the wheat starch into it, adding just enough cold water to make a smooth paste, the consistency of thick cream. The starch dissolved under her spoon with a faint, silky resistance, giving off a clean, cereal smell like fresh bread dough, and she stirred it until there were no lumps remaining, the paste glossy and white in the wooden bowl. The water in the saucepan began to simmer, tiny bubbles forming around its edge and sending up thin wisps of steam, and Harlow poured the starch paste into it in a slow, steady stream while stirring with the wooden spoon. The mixture thickened almost at once, turning from a cloudy liquid to a translucent, milky jelly that blubbed softly as the heat worked through it. And she continued to stir, the spoon moving in the same figure-8 she had used with the copper paddle, the motion as easy and familiar as writing her own name. A little more water, tipped in from the saucepan's spouted lip, brought the starch to exactly the consistency she wanted, thin enough to soak into the fibers of the linen but thick enough to leave behind a crisp, smooth finish when the sheets dried. The cooked starch smelled warm and wholesome, a clean, starchy perfume that joined the other scents of the washhouse to create a layered, comforting atmosphere. Harlow removed the saucepan from the fire with a thick cloth wrapped around its handle and carried it to the table where she had set a clean, wide basin of glazed earthenware. She poured the hot starch into the basin, the liquid settling into a pale, shimmering surface that reflected the grey light from the window, and then she let it cool for a few moments, testing the temperature with a cautious fingertip until it was warm but not scalding, the ideal heat for working with linen without scalding, the ideal heat for working with linen without scalding the starch too quickly. The blue-tinted sheets now waited on the wooden railing, their damp surfaces ready to receive the starch that would give them the crisp body and smooth texture expected of the linens in a country house where standards had not slipped since the old king's time. The first sheet came off the railing with a soft, wet sound, its edges trailing on the flagstones for a moment before she gathered it up. She lowered it into the starch basin, working the fabric down into the milky liquid with both hands, pressing and folding and turning it so that every thread was touched by the starch mixture. The sheet absorbed the liquid greedily, the cotton darkening slightly as it drank, and the starch coated the fibers with a thin, invisible film that would dry into a crisp, smooth finish, giving the linen the crackle and body that made it a pleasure to handle. Harlow lifted the sheet from the basin, letting the excess starch drain back in a slow, viscous stream, and then she carried it to the wooden railing again, draping it carefully so that it hung in even folds without wrinkling, for any wrinkle left in the starched fabric would set hard as the sheet dried and be difficult to remove. She repeated this process for each sheet and pillowcase and tablecloth, the stack on the railing growing higher and the air in the washhouse taking on the warm, clean scent of cooked starch. The work was slow because the starch required an even distribution, and she spent time smoothing each sheet with her palms after draping it, ensuring that the fabric lay flat and smooth, the edges straight and the hems not twisted. Her hands, already pruned from the rinsing water, grew sticky with the drying starch, a thin film of it coating her fingers and then flaking off in tiny white specks when she rubbed them together. She did not mind this sensation, having lived with it on wash days for more years than she could count, and she simply wiped her hands on a damp cloth now and then to keep them from becoming too tacky. The railing had only enough room for about half the sheets at a time, so Harlow had to work in batches, taking down the first set when the starch had begun to set enough that the fabric no longer dripped, and carrying them to the mangle that stood against the wall. The sheets that waited their turn hung from another rail suspended from the ceiling beam, the same rail that had held the dried herbs earlier, now temporarily cleared to make space for the laundry. The sheets swayed gently in the air currents from the fire, their starched surfaces catching the light in a way that made them seem almost to glow, and the whole washhouse had the appearance of a room transformed by the presence of so much white, clean linen, a room that was itself a garment of sorts, dressed in the evidence of its own labor. Outside, the rain had returned in a soft, steady drizzle, its sound no more than a whisper against the slates, a voice so quiet it could almost be mistaken for the wind in the ivy. The window glass had misted over again, this time from the inside, the steam from the starch cooking having added to the already humid air, and the shapes of the birds on the sill were just dark blurs through the fogged panes. The light in the washhouse was amber and grey, the fire's warm glow mixing with the cool, diffused daylight from the window, and every surface that could hold moisture was beaded with it. The copper's dark belly, the iron pump handle, the glass jar of bluing powder, and the smooth, polished wood of the paddles and rods that hung from their hooks, waiting for the next washday. When the last of the starched sheets had been draped over the railing to set, Harlow stood back and looked at the long, white line of them with a quiet, measured gaze. The work was not yet done, for the mangling remained, and after the mangling would come the drying and airing and folding, all the small, final steps that would take the week's laundry from the washhouse to the linen cupboard. But the bluing and the starching marked a turning point. The moment when the sheets ceased to be merely clean and began to be finished, the transformation from soiled, used things into crisp, fresh linens, almost complete. The fire crackled softly, the rain whispered on the roof, and Harlow wiped her hands on her apron once more, before turning to the box mangle, where the heavy wooden rollers waited to press the last of the moisture from the starched fabric and give the sheets their final, smooth, polished surface. After the bluing and starching, when the sheets had rested on the railing long enough for the starch to begin its work of firming the fibers without drying completely, Harlow crossed to the far corner of the washhouse where the box mangle stood against the whitewashed wall. The mangle was a piece of furniture as much as a machine, a heavy construction of oak and beech and iron that had been built by a local carpenter in the time of the house's first master and had remained in the same spot ever since, its feet sinking slightly into the flagstones over the decades so that it now sat with a faint, permanent lean toward the wall. It consisted of a large flat bed of smooth wood over which two heavy rollers were suspended in an iron frame, and a great iron crank on one side that turned the rollers through a series of wooden gears that clacked softly when in motion. The wood of the mangle was pale with age and polished by the passage of countless sheets, its surface bearing a sheen like old beeswax, and the iron parts were dark with a patina of oil and handling that smelled faintly metallic when the machine warmed up. The starched sheets, still damp enough to mold but no longer dripping, had been brought over in armfuls from the railing and laid in a neat pile on a low stool beside the mangle. Harlow shook out the first sheet, a fine percale that now had the crisp, slightly stiff feel of starched linen, and she spread it carefully on the flat bed of the mangle, smoothing out every wrinkle with the flat of her palm before she began. The bed was wide enough to take half the width of a full sheet, and so each sheet would need to be fed through in sections, first one half and then the other, and sometimes turned lengthwise for a second pressing that ensured an even finish. The fabric lay flat under her hands, its white surface glowing softly in the combined light of the fire and the grey window, and the faint smell of cooked starch rose from it, clean and warm and domestic. She reached for the crank handle with both hands, the iron cool against her palms despite the warmth of the room, and she began to turn it. The gears engaged with a low wooden clunk, and the rollers above the bed started to move, their surfaces rotating slowly toward the sheet that waited at their edge. The first touch of the rollers against the fabric was a soft, gripping sound, a combination of a whisper and a creak, as the wood took hold of the starched cotton and began to draw it between the heavy cylinders. Harlow turned the crank with a steady, even motion, her arms moving in a circle that was wide enough to require a slight sway of her shoulders, and the sheet advanced inch by inch through the rollers, emerging on the far side pressed flat and smooth, its surface now sleek and even without a single crease. The sound of the mangle was one of those noises that, like the rain or the fire, quickly became a sort of background to thought. The wooden gears turned with a rhythmic clacking, a gentle, unhurried percussion that kept time with the crank's rotation, and the rollers themselves issued a continuous low squeak as they squeezed the fabric, a sound that varied slightly in pitch depending on the thickness of the cloth passing between them. When a seam or a monogram went through, there was a softer thump, a brief thickening of the sound, and then the squeak returned to its normal note. These sounds layered over the ever-present whisper of the rain outside, which had once again settled into a steady, light drizzle, and the occasional crackle from the fire, which Harlow had stoked back to life with a fresh log of beech, so that the warmth would help the starch sheets to dry without becoming stiff in the wrong way. After the first half of the sheet had passed through, Harlow stopped turning the crank, and walked around to the other side of the mangle, where the pressed fabric lay in a smooth, flat rectangle on the receiving board. She lifted it carefully, folding it back onto itself, so that the unpressed half was now positioned on the bed, and she smoothed it out again, her fingers tracing the edges to ensure there were no hidden folds or bunches that would create permanent creases once the pressure came down. Then she returned to the crank and began the second pass, the rollers taking hold of the starched cotton with the same soft grip, the gears clacking, the wood squeaking, the sheet emerging on the far side, transformed into a piece of fabric that looked almost like thick paper, so flat and smooth and even that it seemed a different material from the rumpled cloth she had plunged into the copper that morning. Each sheet received this treatment twice, once folded lengthwise to press the full width, and then again turned sideways and passed through to press the length. This double mangling was necessary for the larger sheets, for the mangle's bed could only accommodate a portion of the fabric at one time, and Harlow moved through the process with the same patient, methodical economy of motion that she brought to everything. She would feed the sheet, turn the crank, walk around, reposition the fabric, return to the crank, and then begin again, the whole sequence repeating with only the smallest variations from one sheet to the next. The pillowcases required just a single pass each, their small size allowing them to fit entirely on the bed, and the tablecloth took 3 passes because of its awkward square shape and the heavy damask weave that resisted the rollers slightly more than the cotton. The crank required a certain amount of strength to turn, especially when the rollers met the doubled thickness of a seam or hem, and Harlow's arms began to feel the effort after the first few sheets. It was a different tiredness from the lifting and carrying of the earlier stages, a deep, steady ache that settled into the muscles of her shoulders and upper back, and she paused now and then to roll her head from side to side, easing the tension with a soft, unconscious sigh. The wool mitts that she had worn for lifting from the copper had been exchanged for a pair of thin cotton gloves with the fingertips cut away, and these protected her palms from the chill of the iron crank while still allowing her to feel the fabric and adjust it precisely. The gloves were old and darned in several places, their original white faded to a soft cream, and they were as familiar to her hands as her own skin. As she worked, the pile of unpressed sheets on the stool grew smaller, and the stack of finished sheets on the receiving board grew taller, each one as flat and smooth as a pane of glass. The mangled sheets had a different quality from the boiled and rinsed fabric. They were no longer soft and flowing, but crisp and structured, their starched fibers holding the shape she gave them, and when she lifted one, it made a faint sound, a quiet rustle like autumn leaves stirring in a breeze. The surface of each sheet was glossy from the pressure of the rollers, a sheen that would fade as the fabric dried completely and was aired before the fire, and the monograms and embroidered hems stood out in sharp, sculpted relief, every stitch distinct and precise. Harlow ran her thumb over one of these monograms, a simple entwined letter, and felt the texture of the thread under the starch, a small tactile confirmation of work properly done. The rain outside had changed again, as it had been doing all day, now falling in a heavier shower, that drummed with more insistence on the slates and filled the drainpipe with a rushing, gurgling song. The sound was loud enough to be noticeable over the clacking of the mangle gears, and Harlow paused once to look out the window, seeing the grey sky unchanged, the water sheeting down the glass, the shapes of the birds on the sill, now just dark blurs through the streaks and the steam. A gust of wind rattled the window frame, and the flame of the oil lamp that she had lit earlier in the afternoon flickered in its glass chimney before steadying again, its yellow glow adding a warmer note to the grey daylight. The washhouse, with its thick stone walls and its solid roof, absorbed the weather without concern, and Harlow returned to the crank, her mind untroubled by the storm, because the storm could not reach her here. The wooden gears of the mangle, which had been silent for so long between washdays, had warmed to their work, and now ran with a smoother, quieter sound, the initial stiffness of the cold iron having been worked out by the repeated turning of the crank. Harlow noticed this change in the same absent way she noticed the rain. A small improvement in the day's conditions that made the work slightly easier, and she adjusted her pace accordingly, turning the crank a little faster, now that the resistance had lessened. The rollers, too, had warmed from the friction, and now pressed the sheets with a more even pressure, the heat helping to set the starch and smooth the fabric simultaneously, and the sheets emerged from the mangle with a faint warmth that was pleasant to the touch and carried the clean, starchy perfume that had become the dominant scent of the washhouse in this stage of the day. When the last of the starch sheets had been mangled, Harlow stepped back from the machine and let the crank come to a stop, its iron handle pointing toward the ceiling like a raised arm fallen still. The receiving board held a neat, square stack of pressed linen, each piece as flat as if it had been ironed by hand, and the stool beside the mangle was empty, its surface bare, except for a few stray drops of starch that had fallen from the fabric and dried into tiny white specks. She lifted the stack and carried it to the long table under the window, where she would sort it into the order they would be dried, the larger sheets first because they took the longest, the pillowcases and smaller items last because they could be tucked into the smaller spaces near the fire. The weight of the pressed linen was satisfying in her arms, a solid, clean burden that represented the culmination of the day's heavy work, and she set it down with a soft thump on the table. Now came the arrangement for drying, a task that required some planning because the rain showed no sign of stopping and the sheets could not be hung outdoors. Harlow pulled the wooden clothes horses from their storage place behind the door, 3 large folding frames of pine with dowel rods stretched between them, and set them up in a semicircle around the hearth, their legs creaking as she opened them. These horses were old and stained with watermarks from many similar days, their dowels worn smooth by the weight of wet linen, and they stood at a safe distance from the fire where the heat could reach them without scorching the fabric. She also pulled a set of lines that were strung on pulleys across the ceiling beam, lowering them with a wooden cleat on the wall so that she could drape the sheets over them, and soon the space above the hearth was crisscrossed with ropes that would hold the drying laundry in the warm air rising from the embers. One by one, she draped the mangled sheets over the horses and the lines, each piece arranged so that air could circulate around it, the fabric hanging in smooth, even folds that would dry without creasing. The sheets on the horses lay in flat layers, their edges aligned, their starched surfaces already beginning to look dry at the corners where the warmth touched first, while those on the lines overhead swayed gently with the air currents from the fire, their white forms moving like slow, silent pendulums. The washhouse, which had been filled all morning with the sounds of boiling and rinsing and mangling, now settled into a quieter, more static phase, the only movements the soft dance of the hanging sheets and the flicker of the flames and the steady, ceaseless fall of the rain beyond the window. Harlow stood in the center of this forest of white linen, her hands on her hips, her face calm and a little tired, and she surveyed the drying arrangements with the critical eye of someone who knows that a sheet poorly hung will dry with a crease that no amount of airing will remove. She shifted one corner here, adjusted a fold there, moved a horse a few inches farther from the fire so that the heat would not be too fierce, and then she was satisfied. The fire glowed warmly in the grate, its light shining through the fabric and casting soft, diffused shadows on the walls, and the smell of the drying linen mingled with the wood smoke and the lingering starch to create an atmosphere of profound, unhurried domestic peace. The rain drummed its soft, eternal rhythm, and the sheets swayed gently, and the afternoon stretched out before her like a long, calm road, requiring nothing more than waiting and tending, and the quiet patience that had carried her through every washday she had ever known. The drying of the sheets, once they had been mangled and draped over the horses and lines around the hearth, became a task that stretched across the remainder of the day and into the next. A quiet, intermittent tending that required no heavy labor, but demanded a steady attention. The rain outside, which had been the constant companion of the whole washday, continued to fall through the afternoon and evening, and on into the following morning. Sometimes a light drizzle that barely misted the window, sometimes a heavier downpour that rattled the slates and set the drainpipe gulping. But never once did it stop entirely, and the world beyond the washhouse remained a study in grey and green and silver. The cobbled yard, a shallow lake, the elms in the distance swaying with leaves, the sky that shafrukim splikers. Harlow moved among the drying sheets with the same unhurried pace she brought to every stage of the wash, checking each piece in turn by pressing the flat of her hand against the fabric and feeling for the coolness that indicated lingering moisture. The sheets nearest the fire dried quickly, their edges beginning to stiffen and lighten within the first hour, while those farther back on the horses or hanging from the ceiling lines remained damp for much longer, and so her work involved a constant, gentle rotation, moving the drier sheets to the outer positions and bringing the wetter ones closer to the warmth. This rotation was not hurried, for there was no deadline to meet and no schedule to keep, only the natural pace of evaporation and the quiet rhythm of the fire that she fed with small logs throughout the day. You might have seen her if you had looked through the rain-streaked window at any point during that long afternoon, as a figure moving slowly through a forest of white linen, her hands reaching out to touch a hem here or smooth a fold there, her face calm and a little abstracted, her thoughts apparently elsewhere while her body continued its familiar work. The washhouse had grown so warm from the fire and so humid from the drying sheets that the air felt almost tropical, a soft, moist blanket that wrapped around her as she moved, and the scent of the room had deepened into a complex perfume of wood smoke and clean cotton and dried lavender from the herbs still hanging on the beam, and the faint, sweetish tang of the starch that had set into the fabric. The window glass was entirely steamed over now, the outside world reduced to a vague impression of light and shadow, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the rain, and the soft, occasional rustle of a sheet settling as it dried. As the afternoon wore on and the grey light through the steamed window began to dim toward evening, Harlow lit the oil lamp that hung from a bracket on the wall, its yellow flame blooming behind the glass chimney and casting a warm, steady glow that pushed back the gathering shadows. The lamp had a small brass reflector that directed the light toward the drying area, and the sheets caught this illumination in different ways depending on their angle, some glowing like pale gold, others remaining in soft shadow, the whole room taking on the appearance of a painting by one of the old Dutch masters, a study in light and texture and quiet domestic industry. She worked by this lamplight for another hour, turning the sheets, testing the dampness, adding a little more fuel to the fire, and then she judged that the first batch was dry enough for the next stage, the airing that would remove the last trace of moisture and give the linen its final soft, ready feel. The airing was done before the open fire, with the sheets held one at a time in her outstretched arms and rotated slowly so that the radiant heat could reach every part of the fabric. Harlow lifted the first sheet from the horse, the cotton stiff and cool where it had been farthest from the flames, and she carried it to the hearth, standing close enough to feel the warmth on her face and hands, but not so close that the fabric might scorch. She held the sheet up by its corners, the white expanse of it catching the firelight and glowing with a soft pearlescent sheen, and she began to turn it, slowly, steadily, the way a cook turns a pan to warm it evenly, the sheet billowing slightly as the heat rose through its folds. The last of the dampness evaporated in a faint, clean steam that carried no smell except the freshness of the cotton itself, and the starch that had given the fabric its crispness relaxed slightly in the warmth, leaving the sheet smooth and supple rather than stiff. Each sheet received this airing in turn, a process that could not be rushed because the heat needed time to penetrate every fiber, and Harlow stood before the fire with each one for perhaps 5 minutes, her arms growing tired but never unsteady, her concentration fixed on the small task of turning and warming and smoothing. The rain on the roof provided a gentle, constant music, and the fire murmured its own soft song, and the lamp burned without a flicker, and the whole washhouse seemed suspended in a moment of perfect peace, a bubble of warmth and light and clean linen in the midst of the grey, wet world outside. When each sheet was aired to her satisfaction, she folded it loosely and laid it on the sorting table, where a growing stack of finished aired linen waited for the final folding. The folding was the last true task of the washday, the step that transformed the large billowing sheets into neat, manageable rectangles that would fit on the shelves of the linen cupboard upstairs. Harlow cleared the long sorting table of everything except the stack of aired sheets and a small damp cloth she used to wipe away any stray dust, and she positioned herself at the tables,